number plate starts OE66.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum brothers. There's a white Jaguar, license plate OE66. It's just blocking somebody. If you could please move your car. It's just blocking somebody who needs to leave. OE66 white Jaguar. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walah. Ma ba'd. We spoke on Saturday about the story of the revelation of the Quran and its history and how it was revealed upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even before that in Lawh al-Mahfuz and to Bayt al-Izzah, and then over a period of 23 years the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the same disclaimers I gave on that day apply today, that time is short and this is a very detailed topic. It can be an academic topic. There's ikhtilafat, different opinions of the scholars. So inshallah we'll keep it brief, and but just know that there is more detail than what we'll speak about today. So just to remind ourselves of this pivotal ayah from the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafizun. That indeed it is we who have revealed this dhikr, this Quran, and it is we who will preserve and guard it. And there are many other ayat as well. Inna alayna jam'ahu wa qur'ana la yatihi al-batilu min bayni yadayhi wa la min khalfihi. Many ayat that talk about the preservation of the Quran. And just a point for us to mention before we delve into this topic of the compilation and preservation of the Quran al-Kareem is that really no other book on the face of this earth can claim to have been preserved in a way or in any way similar to the way that the Quran has. For example, the New Testament, the authors of the New Testament, they all died like at least 100 years after the death of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. The Old Testament, a lot of the authors, people don't even know who they are, what their biographies were. And the same goes for, the Hindu scriptures and things like that. Whereas with, the Quran al-Kareem, not only do we know who it was revealed upon, we know how it was revealed, who it was then passed on to, the way in which it was preserved, and for every subsequent generation until today, we know every single person, who has kind of formally transmitted this book. So, when we talk about the preservation of the Quran, there's really two ways in which it was preserved. One is orally, and one is, by writing. And the oral transmission of the Quran really is the primary form in which it was preserved. And when we talk about the Quran's preservation, just like we spoke about the revelation of the Quran in three distinct stages, we can also talk about its compilation and preservation in three distinct stages. So these three stages will be in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's the first one. Second, the compilation, preservation that took place in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and then finally in the time of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu as well. So in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we all know, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was a Nabi al-Ummi. He was the unlettered prophet, and he was sent to the unlettered nation, meaning that in general the people in Mecca at that time, they were not, they could not read and write. Some of the scholars mention that in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca, only 17 of the men there were literate, could read and write. And this in itself, lends to our claim of the miraculous nature of the Quran and how it could not have, come from the Prophet ﷺ himself, and how it must have been divine in its origin. So I mentioned about the oral kind of preservation of the Quran. So even though the Arabs at that time in that region, they weren't illiterate people, but they had this strong oral tradition. So not like you and I today, we may struggle to remember basic things, but they would memorize so many couplets of poetry. They would memorize their history. They would memorize their lineages. They would even memorize the lineages of their horses, and they would be able to record these things in an instant. So this oral tradition was already strong amongst the people in that time. And so when the Quran was being revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from day one he was memorizing it, and he was, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Surah Al-Qiyamah, that لا تحرك لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه. So even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he himself was eager to memorize it from the beginning. And we know that the Sahaba were memorizing it from the beginning as well, because we all know that the Salah was legislated very early on in Islam. And a key part of our Salah is recitation of the Quran. So we know that from the beginning, the Sahaba were memorizing the Quran. And we also made mention as well on Saturday that at the beginning, the Quran, when it was being revealed in that initial period, there was a periods of pause. There was, as time went on, the amount that was being revealed increased. And especially towards the end of the Medinan stage of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, many more ayat of Quran were being revealed because of the need for ahkam and the tribes and delegations that were coming. But so in that early period, it's not hard to fathom that the Sahaba, they were committing whatever they heard to memory, and they were able to do so. And even in terms of writing, we also know that from very early on, the Quran was being written. We all know the story from when we were young of Sayyidina Umar, when he came upon his sister before he became a Muslim, and in the house of his sister, and she was, she presented Surah Taha, and it was written down. So this is only 5 or 6 odd years into the mission of the Prophet ﷺ that we can already see that the Quran was, being written down and being taught in this way. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was very keen to spread the Quran and for it to be taught, such that the Sahaba, they mentioned that after the Hijrah, that whenever a new migrant, an immigrant would come to Medina, they would be assigned someone to teach them Quran. And that whenever tribes would enter into Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, he would send his companions to go there and teach them the Quran. So the Quran was being spread far and wide. And we also spoke about this as well, the scribes of the Prophet ﷺ. So the very particular care and attention they were paying to writing down the Quran. That whenever Quran was revealed, the Prophet ﷺ, he would call one of his scribes. And we mentioned there are up to 65 scribes of the Prophet ﷺ. Not all of them were writing Quran. Some were writing his letters and the treaties and things like that. But at least 20, 30, 40 scribes, and most prominent amongst them being Sayyiduna Zayd ibn Thabit, and he will come up time and time again in this story. And so some of the Sahaba, they would have even personal copies of Quran at that early stage, things that they had memorized, things that they had been ordered to write. They would write it down, and they would have personal masahif. We have narrations of at least 15 of the Sahaba, including our mothers, the mothers of the believers, who would have their own suhuf, their own personal renditions and writings of the Quran. And we also mentioned this as well on Saturday, that so many of the Sahaba were committing the entirety of the Quran to memory. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit, Ubay ibn Ka'ab, and then so many of the other senior Sahaba, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhum. So we can see that the Quran was being spread far and wide in the memories of the people, as well as being written far and wide as well. And we mentioned also in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, the meticulous care that was given to reviewing the Quran on a yearly basis with Sayyidina Jibreel, and the Quran's ordering being finalized in that time. And in Al-Aradatul Akhira, in the last year of the Prophet ﷺ, when the Quran was revised twice, and again Zayd ibn Thabit, who we've already mentioned, being there at that time. So one point for us to mention here is that we've seen that during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, during this 23-year period of his prophethood, the Quran was being taught en masse, it was being spread far and wide, it was being written. But that being said, and this is from Zayd ibn Thabit himself, that in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran wasn't compiled in one book between two covers. It wasn't compiled in one book between two covers. The entirety of the Quran had been written, and the entirety of the Quran had been memorized by tens of Sahaba, and large portion of the Quran had been memorized by hundreds of the Sahaba. But in one book form, that wasn't there in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. And there are many reasons why that's the case, and the scholars, they discuss why that is and the wisdoms behind it. For example, Quran was still being revealed. Until, the scholars mentioned, until just 9 days before the passing of the Prophet ﷺ from this world, Quran was being revealed. So how is it possible for the Quran to be compiled in its entirety in one book form when Quran was still being revealed, and when surahs were being revealed, they would have to be placed in certain places. So it wasn't feasible in that way for it to be compiled in one kind of book form. Now moving on, we go to the second period, and that is Al-Jam' fi ahdi Abi Bakr as-Siddiq, the compilation in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr became the Khalifa after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ in the 11th year of the Hijrah, and his Khilafah only lasted for 2 years. And his Khilafah was dominated by Hurub al-Riddah, the wars of apostasy. Many of those delegations and tribes that came into Islam towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, many of them were beginning to leave Islam or refuse to pay the zakah. And we saw this phenomenon of many false prophets arising. So really the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was dominated by this, and that's why we didn't see the borders of the Islamic dominion expand so much in his time, but he did set the seeds for that expansion to begin. But in the 12th year of the Hijrah, so during the time of Abu Bakr's rulership, is when we had the Battle of Yamama. We mentioned the Battle of Yamama on Saturday. The Battle of Yamama was pivotal. It was that battle against Musaylimah al-Kadhdhab, the false prophet. And in this battle, 70 of the Qurra were martyred. And so upon this happening, Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anhu, he was worried, he was concerned that so many of the Qur'an have died. And he was worried that something of the Qur'an may be lost. Now you and I, we may think that, how could Sayyidina Umar think that the Qur'an will be lost? Allah said that He will preserve the book. And the Prophet ﷺ, he came with the Qur'an, it can't be lost. But Sayyidina Umar, he understood very well this concept of at-tawakkul. And we see it here and we see it in other places as well. That yes, we trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken it upon Himself to preserve this book. But Allah is musabbib al-asbab. He is the originator of causes. His sunnah is that, in this dunya, things happen according to His will, but there are means, there are wasa'il in this dunya by which these things happen. So for example, if a person falls sick and they take medicine, we know that shifa is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using the medicine as a wasila, as a means. So likewise, Umar understood that people need to take action and people need to take, do things to enact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. And we have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about tying your camel that we all know. And also in the time of Sayyidina Umar, there was a plague, the plague of Amwas. And some of the Sahaba, they mentioned, because they were going to an area where the plague was ravaging. And so Sayyidina Umar said, let's not go to this area and go somewhere else. So some of the Sahaba asked, they said, Ya Umar, are you fleeing from the qadr of Allah? And Sayyidina Umar said, yes, I am fleeing from the qadr of Allah to the qadr of Allah. So Sayyidina Umar understood very well this concept of tawakkul and taking action. So Sayyidina Umar came to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and he said that he has this concern and so many of the Qur'an have died. So what we need to do something. And he proposed this idea of compiling the Qur'an in one book between two covers. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he was very uncomfortable at first. He felt like this was a bid'ah, this was a innovation. How could we do something that the Prophet ﷺ never did, or didn't kind of explicitly command us to do so? But Sayyidina Umar, he explained it to Abu Bakr, and over time, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he was convinced by Sayyidina Umar that this was the right thing to do. So then Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar, they decided, let's enlist Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit, for a number of reasons. He was young, he was intelligent, he was the primary scribe of the Prophet ﷺ. He had memorized the entirety of the Qur'an by heart. So they enlisted him and they approached him and they told him that we want to compile the Qur'an between two covers and we want you to undertake this task. And Sayyidina Zayd, he had the same response as Sayyidina Abu Bakr. How can I do this? This is something that the Prophet ﷺ never commanded. And he made this famous statement that it would have been easier for me to move a mountain than to do what they were asking me to do. But Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar, they explained it to him and eventually Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit was convinced. So Sayyidina Zayd, he undertook this task. And he had requirements that Sayyidina Abu Bakr gave him, and this comes from the Qur'an, that we need, for every ayah of the Qur'an that someone's coming to you with, we need two people to confirm that they have learnt this directly from the Prophet ﷺ. And not only that, we need a written copy as well that was written in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So these were the stringent requirements. And this was a community effort. It was announced by Abu Bakr in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. Sayyidina Umar was standing at the door of the masjid, as people were coming to bring their copies or recite what they knew. Sayyidina Bilal was sent into the markets to announce and to tell the people to come and bring whatever parchments you have. And Sayyidina Zayd was in the masjid ready to receive the people. And this was how in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, they compiled the entirety of the Qur'an in a written form between two covers. But something for us to note here, interestingly, is that in this in this compilation, that the Qur'an was compiled in its entirety. All of the ayat were in their correct order, but their main objective wasn't to present the Qur'an in like a standardized way. It was just, let's collect it and make sure that we will not lose anything from the Qur'an. It's preserved in a written form. So for example, and we'll see this come later, but it wouldn't have been a book like how you and I imagine a book to be. It would have been a large collection of various parchments or whatever materials that they were writing on, different sizes that they were able to collect. And the surahs, the ayats were all arranged. It wasn't necessarily kind of in the order that we have it today. That is to come shortly. So moving on from this, Sayyidina Abu Bakr passes away in the 13th year after the Hijrah, and Sayyidina Umar becomes a Khalifa. And so naturally, Sayyidina Umar, he inherits the Mus'haf. And then in the lifetime of Sayyidina Umar, as you all know, Islam spread, and so many people came to Islam. So many of the non-Arabs were coming into Islam as well. And then Sayyidina Umar, he was very particular as well, and he was ensuring that the Quran reciters and prominent Sahaba were being sent out to the various provinces to teach the Quran. And then upon the death of Sayyidina Umar, he did not elect his Khalifa, as we know, that a shura was put together, and they nominated the Khalifa. So what happened was the Mus'haf that was in his care from the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr was inherited by his daughter, Sayyidah Hafsa, our mother, who is the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's very fitting for her to take kind of a custodianship of the Mus'haf. And then Sayyidina Uthman, he becomes the Khalifa. And Sayyidina Uthman plays an incredibly pivotal role in this process. And as time goes on and Islam continues to spread, jihad is taking place in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So far away from kind of the Arabian Peninsula. And the Muslim armies in this region comprised of people from different areas. So you had some of the army was from the Syrian region, Sham, and some are from Iraq. And it's interesting that the Syrians and the Iraqis, they tend to have tension between them at various points in our history. And even before our history, people from those regions have tension between them. So even here, an incident occurred where the Syrians and the Iraqis, they were almost quarreling about the ways in which they were reciting the Quran. And some were saying that, no, we are reciting it better. Our way is more correct. And why these differences existed really comes down to the rukhsa that we spoke about on Saturday of sab'atu ahruf. This ease and facilitation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted this ummah to allow certain dialects and things like that to be incorporated into the recitation of the Quran. However, as Islam spread, this what initially was a rukhsa and an ease was now, as we can see, becoming a means of argumentation. So the prominent Sahabi Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman radiyallahu anhu, who is a very interesting Sahabi. He was a Sahabi who the Prophet ﷺ would entrust him with many of his secrets, and he knew a lot of the ahadith about akhir zaman, and he knew a lot of the fitan that were to come and the names of the munafiqun, etc. So he saw this taking place, and he immediately went back to Al-Medina, and he went to Sayyidina Uthman. He said to Sayyidina Uthman that save this ummah before it disagrees about its book, like the Jews and Christians have disagreed about their book. So Sayyidina Uthman, he convened a council of the Sahaba, and he asked them for their advice. So we see here Sayyidina Uthman acting upon this Quranic principle, this sunnah of shura. And he asked them for the advice, but they deferred to him naturally, saying that you are our leader, you are more capable of advising us. So Sayyidina Uthman's opinion was that let's compile an official copy of the Quran, a standardized official copy, and then we will send it out to all the major provinces, and then everything else that is written, we will destroy it. And then there will be one standard copy of the Quran. And the Sahaba, they all agreed to this. There was ijma' agreement upon this, and they all understood the benefit of doing this to prevent any fitna. So Sayyidina Uthman, he called for the copy from our mother Hafsa, and she sent it. Sayyidina Uthman, he enacted a committee headed by none other than Sayyidina Zayd ibn Thabit. And this was a committee of 4 to 12 people, the scholars differ on this, headed by Zayd ibn Thabit, and 3 other prominent Sahaba, including Abdullah ibn Zubayr. But Zayd ibn Thabit, as we know, he is from Medina, and the other 3 Sahaba, they were from Mecca. So they were Qurashi, and they spoke the dialect of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Qurashi dialect is a dialect in which the Quran was revealed. And so, Sayyidina Uthman told them that compile the Quran, standardize it, formalize its spelling, and if any of you differ, spell according to the way of Quraysh, because this is the way in which the Quran was revealed. So then this project began, and the Sahaba again, they took witness from people who had memorized the Quran and written copies, etc., and they formalized the writing of the Quran. And once this process was complete, they sent it out to the various provinces with a qari, with a proficient reciter, and then from these copies, subsequent copies were then officially made. So in terms of the cities, the provinces that the Masahif were sent to, at least 4 places: Medina, Kufa, Basra, and Asham. At least those 4 places. But then some scholars mentioned that there were 2 copies held in Medina. Some mentioned Mecca as well, Yemen as well, Bahrain as well. So between 4 to 8 copies were officially made and distributed. So just to highlight some of the differences between these 2 masahif in the Jama' of Abu Bakr and Uthman ibn Affan. So in the time of Abu Bakr, this compilation project took place because of the fear of losing the Quran. And in the time of Sayyidina Uthman, it was due to incorrect recitations. In the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Zayd ibn Thabit was given this task. In the time of Sayyidina Uthman, it was a committee of people headed by Zayd ibn Thabit. And there are a number of differences as well, but time is short. So a few more points for us to mention. One is ar-rasm, the spelling, the way in which the Quran is written. And this is what we said was really the project of Sayyidina Uthman to try and prevent argumentation and quarreling arising from the recitation of the Quran. So the way in which the Quran is spelt and written, and this was standardized in the time of Sayyidina Uthman, and the way the Quran is written, by the majority of it conforms with the way of the Arabic language. But there are some specific ways that the Quran is written. Some words are connected, some words are not connected. There's some detail to it, but this is preserved in the writing of the Quran. And the scholars, again, there's ijma' that this should not be abandoned. And so from that time until today, even the spelling of the Quran has been maintained. Yes, you can have the Quran written in different calligraphy and styles like that. In terms of the lettering that's chosen, sometimes there's a letter and it's not pronounced, or sometimes there's a letter, 2 words that are joined together, things like this. These have all been maintained. And then this compilation of Sayyidina Uthman, it allowed for the various qira'at and recitations of the Quran to be maintained, and so they were also preserved from that early time. And I wanted to speak about kind of that early text and how it looked, because it didn't look like how the Qur'ans that we have today look. For example, it didn't have the dottings that we have, the tashkil that we have, separated into paras and ajza and things like that. But I think that's too much detail, so we unfortunately we won't speak about that. But I just want to kind of summarize that we see 3 stages in the time in the story of the preservation of the Quran, and this takes place in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ himself, in the life of in the leadership of Abu Bakr, and again in the time of Sayyidina Uthman. And at first, the Quran was written in its entirety in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, but it was compiled in one book in the leadership of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, which is only within 2 years of the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. And then the spelling was standardized, and the way it was written, and the ordering, etc., in the time of Sayyidina Uthman. So again, you're talking 15 to 20 years after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, and from then until now, the rasm is exactly the same, without a doubt. And all of these things have been meticulously preserved and narrated, and the recitations have been preserved and narrated, and we have formal asanid and chains, so that people today who have memorized the Quran or master kind of reciters, you can trace who they learnt it from, and who they learnt it from, and who they learnt it from, all the way back into the Prophet ﷺ. And that's all, that's just kind of in terms of its formal transmission, notwithstanding the fact that the Quran was ubiquitously transmitted en masse from generation to generation. And really that left no space for any errors to creep in, because if anybody wanted to come and say that, no, this is the correct way of reciting the Quran, then hundreds, if not thousands of people will come and tell them this is incorrect and this is not the way the Quran is recited. So as I mentioned, there's a lot more detail to this story. So I do recommend that, if you're interested in this topic, there are things that you can read or listen to, or people you should approach and ask. Anything I said that was incorrect is from my nafs and from shaitan. Anything that was correct is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.